often the best sessions, rather than 400 people all fighting to try to 150 people fighting to get recognized. Okay, I would like to introduce first Manuel Lafarga, who is the professor of music and history aesthetics, and he has taught both of these for many years at higher education centers in Spain. He is currently at the Higher Conservatory of Music in Valencia. He has more than 20 publications and around 50 courses that he taught at the University of Valencia, and where he spent 18 years as associate professor of music. Interestingly, he also has a YouTube channel under his own name that is devoted to all these topics that has about 500 subscribers. He also is part of a team that maintains a website on the topic of what he's going to speak on today, the great Veronese canvas, The Wedding at Cana. And you can find that at easily, the URL is very easy, www.theweddingatcana.org. So please. And because we only have two presenters, I can be a little looser with time, but don't talk for 50 minutes.
Well, good morning. First, many thanks to the Renaissance Society of America and the Scientific Committee, and equally to the audience for paying attention to our work. Our topic is a very relevant one for art history, specifically for Cinquecento and Venetian Renaissance. However, it has been forgotten and ignored during near 5 centuries. To us, it's a privilege, and of course a true pleasure to be here with you in Boston as emissaries or messengers, in this case for the 3 brides who were married at Veronese's campus. Excuse me. These are the 4 sections. The accepted tradition regarding the identity of the bride and groom, as well as that of some of the guests to the right of the Emperor Charles V, is based just on the enumeration made by Anton Maria Zanetti the Younger in 1771, although he omitted his horses, a circumstance which was not an exception in his times. Many authors have repeated the legend started by the Venetian academic, later adding some more guests, imitating his procedure, that is, without citing sources or references. The second author who alludes to guests' identity in an original way is the British collector Henry Frederick Holt in 1867. However, he is not mentioned by the authors who added to Zanetti's enumeration some characters that only he and not Zanetti proposed. Holt, like the Venetian curator did, again omitted his own sources. Otherwise, Zanetti's tradition is mixed with a previous one, although without mention of identities. Carlo Ridolfi says that the bride and groom are at the end of the table to the right of Jesus Christ. The articulation of both stories, however, generates strong semantic paradoxes. Taking them into account literally, it follows that the current bridegroom, Alfonso de Avalos, one of the greatest enemies of Francis I, is marrying the wife of the French king, Eleonor of Austria. This paradoxical setting is happening before the attentive gaze of Eleanor's real husband, the emperor's scorned brother-in-law, even against his will. On the other hand, Alfonso never married Eleanor, but his own wife, Maria de Aragona. After 463 years presiding over her own wedding ceremony, we have rescued the true current bride from oblivion, confessed with a Spanish noble lady. This wedding took place in 1523. However, the original protagonists at the beginning of the commission were in fact the emperor's own sister, Eleonor of Austria, and his staunch enemy, the King of France, who, unlike his wife, remains visible on the canvas today. This was the ceremony in the presence of which the pending funeral mass for Giorgio da Castelfranco was offered, which was his Venetian bride lost in the common graves of the Lazzaretto. The monumental canvas, like many of the guests, had finally two historical moments, two secular weddings for the same biblical event, where, according to John the Evangelist, Jesus Christ worked his first miracle in Cana, turning water into wine to the relief of the first marriage. Although more accurately, it could be said in our case that it was to the relief of the second one, since it's logical to think that the wine had to run out in the second couple. In addition, the first ceremony did not last long, since its time was consumed at the beginning of the commission with the dismantling of the original sang mass. This first ensemble was introduced in 2023 at the 16th Century Conference in Baltimore, and also at the GAHA lectures at the University of Maryland College Park, and later in Helsinki at the Sibelius Academy of Music Symposium in 2024. Oh, excuse me. While the next instrumental formation, this is the GAHA at Maryland. To the right, our own publication devoted to this topic. This next instrumental formation, the Lutz Consort, had been previously introduced at Lucca International Conference in 2019. And this is, I can't find it, this is the artistic recreation by Jorge Camarero after our own graphic analysis and design. This was the second musical formation behind the current canvas. There were four previous ensembles. During the first ceremony, the civil patron of the canvas, the Procurator of San Marco, Girolamo Grimani, was attending to the chords of the harpsichord played by his protégé, Paolo Cagliari, while the author's brother was painting a small modello in front of the Benedictines, just as Holt's story transmitted to us. This circumstance could never be known prior to obtaining X-ray images of the canvas in 1989, unless Holt's source came from a witness of the canvas during the first months of the commission. While in the second marriage, the Marquis of Basto was added to Eleanor's right after the first mutation of the original musical ensemble, thus causing his own wife, Maria de Aragona, to end up burying the original bride, just as happened to Giorgione after the late arrival of Diego Ortiz to Venice few months earlier to canvas completion. In this way, the French king remained widowed and quiet in his same position, looking directly at the already non-existent neckline of a new noble donna who no longer had a relationship with him. Quite the contrary, since her own husband was one of the generals in the service of the Spanish power, who inflicted him the most defeats during his eternal wars with Charles V. Thus, both Venetian scholars, Ridolfi and the second Zanetti, were right, each in their own way. The married couple was always, in fact, at the end of the table, as Ridolfi reported. First at the wedding of the emperor's sister with the French king, she being at the end, and then at the wedding of the new marquis with his own wife, with he being on the end. Zanetti the younger was also right when he reported the identity of the bride as Eleonor of Austria, since this was the authentic civil wedding represented in the original scene, in the presence of the funeral mass for Giorgione. It means during the time that the first consort remained visible on the canvas. The curator of the Biblioteca Marciana may not have had reliable data on the Marquis of Vasto at his disposal, since he omitted his real wife and ended up marrying him instead in triplicate, with his own relative in the real world, Vittoria Colonna, with his own wife on the canvas, and a time with Eleonor of Austria already hidden, even with her own husband sitting next to her, and de facto buried by the Marquis' wife, whose new identity Zanetti was evidently unaware of. On February 24, 1525, the French king was shot down by Spanish arquebusiers under the command of Alfonso de Avalos, leaving him trapped under his horse. Later, he would write a letter to the Marquis of Baston, thanking him for his treatment and for allowing him to keep his life. Charles V was the first to systematically incorporate the new and revolutionary design of the arquebus into military art, the synchronized firing of the musket batteries. For decades, the effectiveness of this new specialized infantry caused a very high number of casualties in the Turkish and French armies, to the point that captured arquebusiers were immediately hanged. The companies of the Spanish tercios could only be commanded by Spaniards. They did not surrender, and to the surprise of their enemies, they fought in silence so that the orders could be heard during the battle. Francis I, considered the prototype of the French Renaissance, was King of France for more than 3 decades. He founded the College of France and the Royal Printing Press, and began the construction of the future Museum of the Republic, currently the Louvre Museum. The marriage was not recognized by Francis until the Treaty of the Ladies, also called Peace of Cambrai, signed in 1529 by his own mother, Louise of Savoy, and by the Emperor's aunt, Margaret of Austria. The new treaty allowed the release of his 2 sons and forced him to pay the Spanish crown a total of 2 million gold escudos. The wedding of 1526 in Spanish territory was celebrated in Illescas, Toledo, and later in French territory after the Treaty of the Ladies in the Abbey of Bayonne on August 5, 1530. Eleonor was the granddaughter of the Catholic monarchs and had traveled to Castile from German lands in 1517, accompanying her brother Charles to occupy the vacant throne left by their grandfather. She was Queen of Portugal when married Manuel I in Lisbon in 1519, deceased in 1521, having also been sold by Louis XII of France and by the Count Palatine Frederick II of the Ring, whom she really wanted to marry. After the defeat of Francis I, Eleonor, already widow, married the imprisoned king in 1526 in accordance with one of the clauses of the Treaty of Madrid. Here, we can appreciate a similar process to that suffered by Eleonor, the superposition of Vittoria Colonna on top of Charles V's wife, Elizabeth of Portugal, after the dismantling of the original consort and the consequent mutation of the first wedding in that of Marquis of Baston. The process is illustrated showing the former coherent emperor's gaze. Elizabeth and Charles' marriage was celebrated 20 days after Francis and Eleanor wedding. So, as we will show in a moment, three queens were seated at the emperor's table during the first ceremony, which included also the Giorgione's funeral song mass. His own wife, his cousin Mary Tudor, and his sister Eleanor, the original protagonist of the event. Maria de Aragona and her sister Giovanna were born and educated in Ischia, and at the end of the 4th decade of the Cinquecento, they frequented together the pro-reformist environments linked to the figure of Juan de Valdez. They were granddaughters of King Ferrante I of Naples. From the minutes of the trial of Pietro Carnesecchi, one of her close friends in Ischia and in the Valdez circle, we know that Maria was also known as Draga because of her haughty character. She married Alfonso de Avalos on November 26, 1523. Some years later, the two sisters became inseparable companions and constituted the head of the Valdés circle in Naples, along with some of the egregious relatives, their mentor Constanza de Avalos, Vittoria Colonna, and Julia Gonzaga. In 1539, Mary moved to the ducal palace in Milan, where Alfonso had been appointed governor, and financed a new literary circle frequented by many of the poets of her old circle in Ischia. After Alfonso's death in March 1546, she moved to a palace in Pavia and established a new literary salon, the Academy of Ciale d'Oro. 1 year later, Maria left Pavia to return to Ischia. There, she reopened her old salon in the Castel del Ovo in Naples, but after a couple of months, a popular rebellion against the viceroy caused the closure of all the literary academies, which led her to reside permanently on her family's island until his death, more than 15 years later. From then on, both sisters collaborated with the literati who had nurtured their academies in Ischia, Milan, and Pavia. Well connected with Venetian editors and printers, these humanists published works in their honor for the support lent to the literary market in Naples in the face of the book burning promoted by the Inquisition in Italian lands. To positively establish the identity of the bride currently represented in the canvas, it's enough to compare the person portrayed by Veronese with 3 of the 4 preserved portraits of Maria de Aragona. The disadvantage of the first marriage was that, despite being the emperor's sister, the male role fell on his own enemy, although he had already been subdued in the year of the depicted wedding. While the second marriage removed the central role from the French and gave it instead to a glorious imperial general and his own family, Avalos, Aragona, Colonna, Gonzaga. At time, doing so to the political network that constituted the center of religious power acquired by Italian spiritualism in the central decades of Cinquecento, an environment protected by the emperor himself and starring by the figure of his veiled agent, Juan de Valdés, Naples, and the fortress of Ischia. It is indeed surprising that for 250 years, and especially since the last 3 decades, this incongruity has not been noticed until our works. We have already mentioned that his amazement and surprise, as depicted on the canvas, do not do justice to this unusual situation either. This is undoubtedly due to the fact that Veronese left the French king quiet and static in the face of the changes that occurred after the dismantling of the funeral Saint Mass. However, Zanetti's identification of some egregious guests turns Alfonso de Avalos in an adulterous and incestuous bridegroom, it seems to enjoy a broad consensus to this day. Zanetti attributes to Vittoria Colonna a relationship with Alfonso that does not correspond to him, but to his uncle. He also says that the woman who sits next to him is the wife of the King of France, that is, the Emperor's sister. Thus, Zanetti states literally in a paradoxical way that the bride at Veronese's wedding is the wife of the French monarch in the real world, and at times the wife of Alfonso de Avalos on the canvas, even in the presence of her own husband. While he attributes to the Marquis of Baston the status of his own aunt's husband, in addition to the role he represents on the canvas, it means a crossing of up to 3 different marriages, a double one for Eleonor, adulterous, and a double one, adulterous and incestuous, for the Marquis, who is the common element of the 3 mentioned marriages. These obvious contradictions have endured to this day in literature without meriting more attention than what we are pointing out here. However, Zanetti's mention of Eleonor as the bride of the banquet becomes real and probable, taking into account the obligatory consideration that his source must again necessarily come from this original historical circumstance, that is, from those who contemplated the canvas during the first months of commission. Both current protagonists were added after the dismantling of the original console with voices and harpsichord, when the arrangement of the tables showed a Palladian design, symmetrical, free, and clear. Maria burying the original bride, Eleonor of Austria, and Alfonso assuming his new role and receiving the miraculous wine with the arm of the original harpsichordist, Paolo Cagliari. Eleonor assuming in advance what would finally be the Giorgione's final destiny. The emperor's wife and cousin, Elizabeth and Mary Tudor, suffered the same fortune. It is likely that the lady who originally flanked the first groom, Francis, on his left, was indeed Mary Tudor, as Zanetti and later Holt say, since her presence was consistent with Eleanor's wedding, given the relationship that united the Queen of England with the imperial family. It thus seems that Veronese represented a fourth wedding, that of the son and heir of Charles V with his own cousin. Philip II and his companion Cristoforo Madruzzo, in a clearly prominent position compared to the rest of the guests, on the balustrade to the viewer's right, are the highest political authorities alive at this time. Philip, because he was the king of Naples and Sicily at the time of the canvas and since 1554, and because his father, the emperor, had already died. And the person before him, because he is probably the Prince Bishop of Trent and the host of the council during the three convocations. Even though Madruzzo's adherence to the spirituality is not explicitly admitted, his accredited links with the political religious background that the message of the order entails, the Benedictine order, his response to the repression of the main exponents of this heterodox network amply justify his presence in the wedding. Oh, excuse me. I was speaking on this slide. She is probably Philip II, the two more prominent, and she is probably Cristoforo Madruzzo, the amphitryon of the Council of Trent. It was lines indicates the accredited links with some of the spirituality. We know with many probability who are the many of them, except 5 or 6 persons. But it's not the topic for this presentation. I'm finishing. For our part, taking into account the true identity of the current bride, Maria de Aragona, and the presence of Vittoria Colonna and Giulia Gonzaga, we are proposing de nuevo the presence of 2 other direct relatives of the bride, her own sister Giovanna in place of Mary Tudor, and the most relevant lady in the Neapolitan castle of Ischia, Constanza de Avalos, as Jesus Christ's mother. In this way, the 5 nobildone who sponsored the Neapolitan circle of Juan de Valdez, in addition to the emperor, seem to constitute the pro-reformist female nucleus depicted on the canvas. We have added to the viewer's left, below the black line, the 3 queens and emperor's relatives who were present at the first ceremony. They are aligned with the previous ubications. By this order is the first bride, Eleonor of Austria, Mary Tudor, and the third, Charles V's wife, Elizabeth of Portugal. Finally, the official bride and groom of the biblical banquet remained in the center of the table, as ordered by the current pictorial canons, Constanza and Jesus Christ, whose identity we also suspect, but will reserve for the moment. Like the majority of the guests, both correspond in the hidden plot of the Benedictine order to two characters linked to the Italian stream of the self-proclaimed spirituali. This intellectual network of coevals, high prelates and ecclesiastics, mainly Venetians, advocated for the peace with reformed lands during the decades earlier to conclusion of the Council of Trent. We are showing the molding of their faces in color. However, it is probable that there are someone more. The spirituali were protected by the emperor himself and by the imperial nobility in Italian lands, especially those Romans and Neapolitans, the Colonna and also the Gonzaga. Some of our illustrious guests were persecuted by Roman authorities, up to 13, as far as we know of them, those depicted in dark pink. 3 of them were processed, and 3 were not because of their earlier death, while another 7 were directly or indirectly executed, most of them earlier to conclusion of the canvass and the Council of Trent. Thank you very much for your attention.